Hello and welcome to iBridged Leadership Stories. I'm so excited for our next guest, Heather Gille. As an award winning chief people officer and HR executive, she has an incredible history of transforming organizations and building companies in the Fortune 500 and mid market with revenues spanning 250 million to over 700 million, with employee bases ranging from 500 to over 1,200. Heather has led one of her companies to earn the prestigious Newsweek Award, Best Global Places to Work, earning the number two spot in this category. And Heather and her leadership teams have won additional awards for Top Company Culture, Top HR Leadership, and Best Company Happiness. We're going to be talking about world-class HR strategies, concepts, and tools that drive effective, high-performance cultures, delivering strategic results. You're not going to want to miss this. Please join me in welcoming Heather Gille, most recently Chief People Officer of Grammarly, to the stage. Heather, it is wonderful to be with you today. Welcome.
Oh my gosh, Jeff, it's so great to see you. You are looking healthy and fabulous as usual. And I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to the podcast today. I am absolutely thrilled to spend the time with you and kick off 2025 with you.
Thanks so much, Heather. Yeah, 3 days a week in the gym, whether I need it or not. Thank you. So, listen, thanks so much for joining. I cannot wait to get into this conversation with you. And I'd like to just jump right in. I want to give a little bit of background and some context. You've created award winning people strategies that have enabled HR to become a strategic partner in organizations, improving HR alignment significantly with the business to enable amazing results and outcomes, including several significant exits, which we'll talk about in a bit. You also have a really interesting profile. You spent the first 10 years of your career on the business side in sales, finance, operations, and you even owned a P&L statement.
Mm.
I suspect that having that operational exposure has informed your leadership style. Because of this, I guess, and I suspect that you speak the language of business and people management with a focus on significant business results. Some of those results include reducing operating expense by $2.5 million annually while improving HR efficiency by 30%.
Mhm.
You did this partially through integrating new technology innovations, specifically an AI driven recruitment platform, while automating HR key functions like payroll, benefits administration, performance management. On top of that, if that wasn't enough, in the category of significant results, you drove successful human capital initiatives via mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, and strategic transactions valued at $17 billion dollars through integration and value realization across the business. And I have to tell you, Heather, I'm having a little bit of a fanboy moment right now. Newsweek Best Places to Work Award, successful exits around $17 billion, dollars, integrating leading edge technologies. I'm just wondering if there's anything you can't
Oh,
do.
you're so sweet.
Let me start with a question I think many of our viewers and listeners are asking themselves. What is the secret to so many of your high impact organizational transformation successes?
Yeah. Well, let me just start by saying I'm deeply attracted to companies that are either in high growth or high fix modes. And that means that you're fixing the plane while you're flying it. Things are operating super fast and you need to be nimble. And in the chaos of joining a new company, I have it on the wall here. I actually draw inspiration from Wayne Gretzky's quote, which is I skate to where the puck is going,
Mhm.
not to where it's been. And it reminds me to focus on opportunities rather than past successes, right? Because you're always continually learning, pushing yourself, growing. And here's another fun fact about me. Having spent 13 years in retail, it's also been ingrained on me to use the magic of art and science when solving complex problems. So let's get back to your question. I find it super useful when creating high impact transformational strategies to lean in and start with the science part of that equation. And
Mhm.
this is where I identify where the puck has been and where it needs to be headed. So here's what
Mhm.
I do. Okay. So first, I ground myself in the today and I learn more about the basics of what's happening in the business. Like, what's the current people strategy and what's the business strategy and what are the commitments that the company's made through stated goals. And from there, I conduct a top level assessment. And that helps me identify two things quickly. So, first is what's working within the people team, And second, what isn't.
I love that assessment step. I think it's critical in my mind. From my perspective, you have to understand what is the current state before trying to gain clarity and alignment with other executive leaders around what could be.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, from there it's all about creating the plan to move forward, right? And so then I partner with the CEO, my boss, and I create an acute or a short-term action plan for immediate actions. And this approach allows me to do a couple things. First, we refocus the team on the strategies and the behaviors that are going to drive quick, consistent wins. And so as you think about that, really important because it pushes in what I call like new fresh ventilation and
Mm,
energy into the team because they're starting to see things like organizational shifts or role adjustments, or maybe even just how we choreograph the work streams differently. And in this phase, they're seeing like I said, the quick wins that present numerous opportunities in the company. And that's part one. And then in part two, the next part, I focus on the art part of the equation. And the art
mm,
really is a shift to building the HR function to support the business's future state. It requires a more comprehensive and strategic approach that involves things like extensive negotiation with a variety of different people, right? Because we're kind of doubling down on an investment that's going to mature over time. And so that means that we're talking to people at the executive level, extending all the way to divisional level leadership.
mhm.
And as you think about it, it's like we take a deep dive into workforce planning and we're talking about things like what are the skills and the talent and the needs required for the business to thrive in horizons like 6 to 9 months and 1 to 2 year
Ah,
times out.
mhm,
And then lastly, here's another secret, which is as the chief people officer, you're also setting the tone for how your teams work. So more in the spirit of that art in the equation, I also want to call out two attributes that differentiate superior people teams from others. And those attributes are two things. The first is resiliency, and
mhm,
the second is adaptability. So as we
mm,
peel those away, resiliency is the ability to withstand the expected and the unexpected. And if you think about today's ever-changing business conditions, this is just par for the course. But when you introduce that mindset into the team, they expect it and it becomes, a qualifier for how they show up every day. And then the adaptability is the characteristic to take advantage of key opportunities when presented. So I'm super excited as we get more into the webcast that we'll be able to build more on these attributes.
Gosh, I love the whole idea of resiliency and adaptability. I think in today's world, it's probably I don't know, can you train for them? I don't know if you can train for them. Maybe you can, but it seems like they are mission critical in their importance. And Heather, I wanna pivot back to the Wayne Gretzky quote. It's
Mhm.
so clear and succinct, and I think that's exactly what our viewers and listeners are craving. Skate to where the puck is reminds me of one of the 7 habits of highly successful people, one of my favorite habits, which is begin with the end in mind,
Mm,
which speaks to the importance of having a clear vision, which you're clearly doing, and you've mapped that out for us here.
right.
I also really enjoy the change management language that you brought to the conversation. I love your current state versus future state modeling, and I'm beginning to now see and understand why you've been so successful in transforming whole organizations. I think also your answer is resonating with me, in some ways, it's validating for me to hear as our strategic approach at iBridge is very similar. If I were to restate your model, I would say understand the current state,
Mhm.
compare that to where the long-term vision is and where it's going. See the gaps that are going to prevent you from getting there and then solve for those gaps. It's brilliant. It's simply stated. Thanks so much for sharing that. I love everything about it. So what happens next, Heather? Your vision is in place. I'm sure you're focusing on excellent execution, but what else is on your mind?
Yeah. So for me, it's all about delivering results. Like at the end of the day, you're paid to do a job, right? So excellence is the foundation of everything we do and in every organization that we build. But here's a common mistake that people make, which is delivering results without aligning to the people behind them is a common mistake. So,
Mhm,
what I try and be intentional about as a chief people officer is focus on supporting two key groups. So, the first is the teams that I lead, and the
mhm.
second, and more important, are the teams that we support.
Ah, mhm,
Right? And so while the teams that I lead is obvious, right? You're the manager. The emphasis on the organization's leader is where the real strategic value lies. And
Mhm,
I think about the teams that we support, it's not just about partnership at the executive level. I make a point to connect with the middle managers
mhm.
because that's where the real work is happening, right? They're the ones that are going to tell you like what's happening on a daily basis, what's the real temperature check of that company.
That front line.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a group of people that are ultimately going to adopt the programs and the changes that we initiate.
Mhm,
And since we depend on these leaders to create scoring opportunities, my strategy always includes partnerships and alignment to elevate them. Because what we
mhm,
know is when these leaders perform at their best, the entire org wins. I'd say that these leaders are force multipliers, which is why I focus so much on developing the group. And I've done things like initiating programs like Year of the Manager
mhm.
or developing other key training programs that ensure that these managers have proper support and focus to prioritize their growth and development, but also their impact in the org.
Mm. I love that idea of focusing on middle managers. It makes so much sense. I also love the prospect of, what I heard you talking about was something that I would categorize as leader enablement. And the concept of leadership as a force multiplier, which to me is dead center over the target. It feels like it has a strong and proactive potential to be a competitive advantage in organizations, and I
Mhm.
also think it's probably likely overlooked in a lot of organizations. I'm guessing this is one of the core, maybe foundational, think of it as a cornerstone to your success so far. Could you talk more about the strategies, tools, or models that you bring to bear, that
Yeah.
are effective in leadership and talent development
Yeah.
as you described?
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about it, companies are continually asking, how do I differentiate myself from others?
Mhm.
And a
Yep.
lot of employees and new hires are looking to learning and development as an opportunity to be that differentiator.
Mhm.
So I've been lucky to work at companies, Fortune 200 companies like Hewlett Packard and Gap and McKesson, and I've seen programs rolled out at scale. For example, we applied DeWick's growth mindset. I've
Mhm.
seen Blanchard and Hershey's situational leadership, another good
Mhm.
one. And then I've seen a ton of mix of both off the shelf and custom courses that are
Mhm.
designed to enhance managers' ability to do things like provide feedback and motivate results from their teams. But there's one that absolutely stands out as a favorite, and that's Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
Mhm.
And as you know, this model has grown in popularity with so many teams. And for me, I love the focus on its effectiveness. And I have to say to you personally, you have so elevated my game by recommending this one. So I really just want to thank you, Jeff, and the iBridge team.
Awesome.
And the reason that I got so excited about this podcast is there are so many podcasts and posts and articles on what HR leaders are facing in today's workplaces and what they can do to like make that impact and drive difference. But at the end of the day, like here's what it always comes down to. Whether you're talking about work or personal or results, it always comes down to team connection, team alignment, and team trust, right? And if one of those is broken, I can guarantee you that your team is not operating in fifth gear. And
Mm,
this model ensures that the teams reach that fifth gear at the most intimate levels.
mm,
And so, what you learn from the 5 dysfunctions of a cohesive team is nothing like I've experienced in my 25 years of working on teams. This approach has been so instrumental. And I think back to the examples we'll be talking through of like driving deep connections and collaboration and effective communication. And when we talked about the art of getting the equation right, this is like an investment of how are we setting the tone for how the executive leadership team shows up? And then how are we showing those examples for other people to emulate throughout the organization, thus creating this like cultural change and nuance. And so from direct experience, I can say that we elevate across the board because we start to create more team cohesion.
yeah, yeah, and first of all, I love the 5 behaviors model, and I'm passionate about it because I've seen major, major transformation occur on teams, really unlocking their full potential, and I can't even tell you the number of times that I've heard clients say things like, I didn't know a team could work this well together. In other words, they'd never experienced what it was like to work on such a high performing team. And every time I hear that, of course, it makes me smile and sort of warms my heart. Other comments that I've heard are things like, I've been on teams, but it usually takes years to be able to build this
Mm,
level of cohesion. And, we're doing it in a couple of quarters.
mhm,
So let me just pause for a second here. What I'll do is I'll pull Lencioni's model up and put it on the screen for others to see. And then for our listeners on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, I'll do a quick walkthrough since you can't see this visual. This is the model of the five dysfunctions of a cohesive team, and it looks like a pyramid. And the pyramid has a bottom element to it, which is based on trust, followed by conflict, then commitment, accountability, and then results are on top. And there is an interoperability and interdependency with these various behaviors. In other words, there's a reason why trust is the bottom or the foundational behavior that we look for. And then we move into conflict. Because when we have trust, healthy conflict, versus the sort of destructive conflict that often occurs in organizations, conflict now becomes something that's beneficial. It
mhm,
allows us to push back and challenge ideas and approaches. And when we do that, it allows us to open up what I call real commitment. When we get real commitment, that means that people are going to say yes and do yes to the things that they're agreeing to. When commitment is operating well, then it allows us to unlock the potential of accountability. Accountability becomes useful and meaningful. And as a side note, the majority of teams that we work with, and then we assess against these five behaviors, accountability is often what I call the Achilles heel, meaning it is the lowest scoring of those behaviors. And I think the history of accountability is that it often gets operationalized in a way that becomes it drives a state of high conflict, and so people back off and they don't engage. We like to teach people how to use accountability to actually move a team forward. And once we have accountability, this is the key for me. Once we have the accountability, then we can focus on that balance between individual results and team-based results. So you mentioned the five behaviors as one of your favorites. I'll take this graph down.
yeah.
You mentioned five behaviors as one of your favorites. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think before I dive into the model itself, could I spend just a moment to zoom out and walk through
Yeah.
what I look for in a solution like this?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So context is always so important, right? So when I think about enabling leadership and development across the organization, it has to deliver on a couple of key fronts. So the first is it has to scale from an individual team member or be a strategic asset to the entire company through the learning and development function. So I'm looking for it to be nimble. The
Mm,
second is it has to work at all levels of the organization from the C suite down to the line level.
mhm,
Third is it has to be easy to use, right? I always want HR to be intuitive and simple.
mhm,
Fourth, and this is an important one, I'm looking for a model that is going to be embraced ongoing. And I want you to think of this as a culture builder. And this is where a lot of companies are going to do the one and done. You went through training, you're fixed, right? This is where, again, you're investing in this program and it becomes part of the way of life. And then
mhm.
lastly, and let's not forget, like we're looking for immediate results, and those results have to be both felt as well as seen. So I'm looking for like numerical as well as those a numerical results.
I love your fourth point here. It's one that resonates with me personally. Organizations spend a lot of money on quote unquote team building. I'm doing air quotes here for our listeners, on team building, and they are very often a one and done. And the criteria that you've applied is, yeah, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do that training, but we're going to focus on making sure that it is something that is usable, scalable on an ongoing basis, and that it continues to support and drive team cohesion. Tell me a little bit more about what you love about this model.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a fanboy, right? Like, I love the simplicity and the clarity of the model.
Mhm,
I think users of any level or background will find that the concepts are really easy to understand. So, we talked about making HR simple, and I love that the concepts are articulated in plain and practical language, which is
mhm.
something that I love. Like, gone are the days of HR nomenclature. Next, I think that the behaviors themselves are very actionable. So, for example, as you were walking through the pyramid, building trust is something that teams can actively work on. And in Lencioni's model, it really is about sharing vulnerabilities and engaging in healthy
Yeah.
conflict. I love the simplicity and the clarity of the model. So, first is users of any level or background can use it because the concepts are easy to understand and implement. And because the concepts are articulated in plain and practical language, which is something that I love, it
Mhm.
means that gone are the days of complex HR nomenclature.
Mhm.
Next, the behaviors themselves are actionable. So, for example, building trust, that bottom of the pyramid, is something that teams can actively work on immediately by doing things like sharing vulnerabilities. And then they can move into engaging in healthy conflict, which can be practiced by engaging in open discussion, like
Mhm.
getting conversation and elephants out of the room, right? And in today's society, we want action. And each behavior themselves provides clear and concrete actions that teams can implement right away. The second part of what I love about this model is that it works across a variety of different teams. So, whether you're an leadership team, or a project team, or a small cross functional team,
Yeah.
sports team, like husband and wife, I mean, it's made so that it's extremely versatile and adaptable for so many environments.
Mhm.
And I love the fact that Lencioni's focus on how team members interact with one another rather than focusing on like external factors on things like resources or market conditions or things that they just don't have control over,
Mhm.
keeps it real because he's like,
Mhm.
I'm literally inviting you and expecting you to study this and take action today. And that
Mhm.
focus on internal dynamics means that teams are improving with actions right away, which is actually within their control. And then lastly, I'd say teams themselves are motivated with measurable progress with data. So you're going to get a scorecard before you take the class, and then you're going to get a scorecard 6 months after. And there's
Mhm.
going to be multiple moments where, again, we're not talking about the one and done. If you do this right, you're going to implement it with how you actually operationalize your teams and your meetings on an ongoing basis. And then people are going to see that throughput line and really see the impact of the training.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that measurability component is also on my mind as a critical success factor. And you mentioned come back 6 months later. We recommend a 4 to 6 month recheck. And if I tie that back into the change management modeling that you used earlier, we go in initially and we do that assessment. We understand the data of the team today. Where are you today? What is your current state?
Mhm,
We then set some goals up and we say, where would you like to be in 4 to 6 months? And then
mhm,
we come back and we measure their progress. Sometimes there's not progress. Every once in a while, there's even some regression, which is really healthy to root that out and to be able to see it. But we can repeat that process of measuring progress and remeasuring and creating that new current state until the team has achieved the level of cohesion and performance that they're looking for. We also find that, throughout that 4 to 6 month window, it's not uncommon for there to be people changing on the team. So, new people in seats. And so that idea of remeasuring allows you to account for, new personnel changes in the process.
mhm.
So Heather, I often think about how teaming, when teaming is awesome and when it's done right, what a wonderful thing that is for people. And then, I think about the dynamics of teaming in organizations today and how important it is to get that right.
Yeah.
Um, Heather, I often think about how important teaming is and how awesome it is when we get it right. I
Mhm.
also know how potentially awful it can be when we don't get it right, and I'm sure you've experienced that. I know I certainly have, not only in, my own personal professional life, but, also in the teams that I work with. We often see teams that are having a real struggle with cohesion, and
Mhm.
accountability and conflict often come up, and trust is almost always the root. Can you give me some examples of where you've enabled organizations to get teaming right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love your concept of the future state, right? Because you and I are cut from the same cloth. Anyone that knows me knows that I approach problems with a grounded question of
Mhm.
what are we solving for,
Yeah.
right? And I want to give you just a couple of examples of the before and the after of using this model. So In this particular example, I'm going to talk about onboarding a group of new senior
Mhm.
executive leaders. And so in this example, we had a group of executives who knew very little about each other. I will say that there were 7 people on the team, and 4 people worked in the same geography, which meant 3 people were remote. So you were dealing with geography as well as tenure, as well as, just having this new executive team come on board. And I remember I reached out to you and I had an initial conversation about the fact that these new leaders were having pretty few tethers that tied them together. And every time we came together, people were super polite and they were reporting on their business. But we were kind of missing that component of like, how do we calibrate our styles and experiences? And like, how do we like go through the journey, right? Like people talk about like they've been through the battle of war together.
Yeah.
We didn't have time to go through the battle. So it was really time for us to just get real. And
Mm.
so in this example, it was about like, how do we fast track the building trust? And so here's why it worked. So, as you mentioned before, trust is the first and most critical dysfunction to address. And the group of executives who didn't know each other very well, trust was okay. I'd say it was low, but it wasn't bad, right?
Mhm.
But here's what the 5 dysfunctions did for us. When you look at the fact that it emphasizes vulnerability based trust,
Mhm.
which is completely different than like, I'm just going to talk to you about business, it means that team members are going to get comfortable sharing not just their professional fears and expertise, but they're going to get into personal challenges, weaknesses, mistakes. And for a new team with little rapport, building trust this way is critical.
Mhm.
And what I can tell you is people got really personal with their examples. I mean,
Yeah.
you were there,
Yeah.
right? Tears were shed.
Yeah.
People said they shared things in that room that they hadn't even told their spouses,
Right.
right? And real connections were formed. And what we learned about each other were things that would never have come out of working together
Yeah.
and how it helped, right? The process of opening up about personal stories or admitting when people didn't have all the answers allowed team members to see each other as human and relatable. And this team started operating as a unit who really had each other's back and began to rely on each other, not just about as colleagues, but like as individuals and friends who were invested in one another's successes. And, we talk about peer coaching like this in an essence kind of created mini coaches for each other.
Mhm.
And what I can tell you to this day is this team still remains one of my favorite group of executives, and we still keep
Mm.
in touch with each other. Like over the
Mm.
holidays, people were pinging each other, "Happy New Year. I hope you're doing well," right? And that just is something that will never be taken away from us.
Real, deep, meaningful relationships. That
Yeah.
is that is the foundational goal of everything that we do, and I'm so glad that you got to experience that firsthand. You also talked about vulnerability-based trust, which is very different from the other types of trust we haven't talked about in detail, but that exist. And it's just so vulnerability is so hard to establish for a number of really good reasons. And yet you mentioned the tethers that get created. This is the very connective tissue in those deep and meaningful relationships required for the type of trust that actually binds. I love everything about the story that you told. It was magnificent to be a part of it. I'm honored to actually be a part of that process. So juicy. Any other examples you'd like to share?
Yeah. So in example number 2, we were struggling with constant change and competing priorities. So if you're
Mhm.
a listener, you should literally have the biggest smile on your face because you're like, I am doing that too.
Right.
So we were solving for an environment that allowed us to get better at real time calibrations. So here was the truth: we already had mad respect for each other as a team, and we had deep understanding of the business, but we were almost too friendly. So here's the reality: our business is operating in a fast, ever changing environment, and in addition to the commitments that we made to our shareholders, other projects were constantly being added to the list. And we needed permission as a group to get real and raw with each other
Yeah.
and make those hard decisions. So, in this instance, we are focusing on the middle part of the triangle, which is engaging in healthy conflict
Yep.
and navigating competing priorities. And I'll tell you why it worked. Well, competing priorities, when they lead to conflict and when they're managed poorly can often result in passive aggressive behavior or silos,
Mhm.
right? And so it's like teams talking on the side or people not connecting. And in a constantly changing environment, teams often report that they feel like overwhelmed or
Right.
frustrated by competing demands. And without that healthy conflict, issues remain unaddressed.
Right.
So, what's special about this example is that the team used the five dysfunctions model to get good at popping between the levels. So, remember how I talked about the simplicity of use? This is where we moved to conflict in order to drive accountability and alignment. And so the model emphasized a really healthy technique and, quite frankly, an expectation for us to call out those elephants in the room and
Right.
for people to give each other permission to feel good about the conflict.
Hmm.
I mean, how many people have worked in companies that avoid conflict? Like, I can name at least four off the top of my head. And so this model teaches teams. And again, what's great about this is when you roll it out, it can be at your executive level, it can be at your middle level, it can be at cross functional level. It starts to teach people different behaviors and different expectations of how to debate in constructive ways and to do it respectfully. And the discussion itself before had prevented important issues from being addressed, or
Right.
they were ignored and swept under the rug. And, for us in this business example, the team came together and made a very bold decision about the business and the commitments that they were going to make to their shareholders.
Hmm.
They doubled down on one part of their business to grow the top line. And it was one of these moments where, again, like, we were thinking, is this the right thing to do? Because when you doubled down, it meant we had to make sacrifices in other parts of the business. And so
Mm.
everyone had to be online with it. But if you dialed forward the calendar 6 months later, it was such a successful endeavor that not only were we seeing the results, but we were so enthused at the like modeling that we had gone through that
Hmm.
we operationalized that prioritization activity into every one of our weekly meetings.
Phenomenal. Yeah.
And here's what's amazingly like icing on the cake, cherry on top. So if that wasn't enough, why else do I get excited? Well, you and I have also taken this to the next level at Certinia, where we implemented disc profiles, which transformed the culture so positively because now people had concepts and perspective about how people perceived information and how they showed up and how they processed. That you were now creating an environment that was healthy for conflict and alignment, but you were also giving people awareness and perspective. And it literally became what, when we talked about the force multiplier, that
Hmm.
force multiplier on multiple levels.
I love that you're bringing up DISC. DISC is, one of the top psychometrics out in the world today. And if you don't mind me sharing, you have a DI style, which means you are naturally driven to focus on successful outcomes and delivering results. That's the D side of your personality. The I side of your personality is optimistic and enthusiastic and engaging and warm and friendly and connecting. And so, in some ways, it makes a really great think of it as a psychology or psychological profile for being in an HR leadership role. And Heather, this is such a great example of world class level HR leadership. I suspect our listeners are connecting with your significant success in the HR leadership role and your approach. I wouldn't be surprised if some folks wanted to reach out to you just to have a conversation or a deeper dive with you on these successes. Are you open to that?
Oh my gosh, for sure. Like, look, I at this point in my career, I am about leaving a legacy and helping people
Mm,
learn more. And so I can tell you, here's what you should know about me. I'm passionate about organizational transformation, about leadership development, about effective people strategies, about just making a difference. So my LinkedIn profile's up to date, and I'd say feel free to message me and I'm happy to chat.
love that. I love that. Heather, I am significantly enjoying this conversation and could literally talk about this topic all day and have done so many times. But let's move to some of your personal career aspects. I think about when you think about the time that you were maybe 20 years younger, 20 years ago, what advice would you give yourself if you had the opportunity to travel back in time? Or conversely, what career advice would you give maybe your daughter or any other, younger person or new to the career coming up?
Yeah. Um, So my path was so atypical. I literally navigated from one function to the next based on what I would call luck and curiosity.
Mm,
But here's what I would leave you with. So we have a couple kids, and I remember attending a college campus tour, and the facilitator, who was leading the campus tour, by raise of hands, asked the crowd this. There were 100 people there, and he said, "Who works in the same industry from which you graduated?" And I'd ask you, how many hands went up?
Probably very few.
1. It was 1 hand in
Mm,
the facilitator asked, "Who what do you do?" And they're like, "I'm a lawyer," right? So,
mm,
here's
mm,
my advice. Stay open to opportunities and believe in yourself, because here's what life is gonna do. It's gonna take you in different directions. It's gonna take you in different directions personally, professionally, geographically, family. There's just gonna be things that you can't control. But what you can control is you can show up every day with a positive attitude. You can ask great questions, you can stay engaged. And what I can tell you is that managers appreciate people who have a strong willingness to learn and the ability to adapt. And so remember, we talked about adaptability and resilience. And so what I'd say is start to think about how that plays out in your life every single day, because
mhm,
we're constantly learning. And if you stay focused on learning and you've got that positive energy, I promise you that the journey is just going to present itself, because there's
mm.
just going to be people that are attracted to your energy and your positivity, and they're going to find places for you to continue to learn and make impact.
Mhm. I love the academic, let's call it academic alignment with your ultimate career, and how rare that happens. That was true for you as well. I think your degree is in finance, and
Mhm.
you're an HR leader. Of course, a finance degree is gonna serve, any discipline in business, I think, anyway. I also think that your point about, being opportunistic and flexible and resilient is really well placed. I love, love, love the advice on positive attitude. There's so much negativity in the world. It's easy, one, to absorb it and then to reflect it. And I think if we're conscious of that and take active steps to put ourselves in a positive attitude and show up in a positive and optimistic state, that's only going to serve going forward. Such great advice for both young and seasoned professionals. I think that applies to everyone. Okay, my next question, and Heather, please feel free to have some fun with this one. What was the very best leadership advice you received in your career? And this would be advice that you might share with your closest colleagues or friends. What would that be?
Mhm, mhm. Wow. You're just putting me on the stand here. Well, okay, so here's what I will tell you is I try and emulate all the behaviors and the techniques that my previous managers and mentors used, as a way to motivate and inspire me. And I try and wrap them all up into one continuous blend of support and encouragement and pushing of our teams, right? And what you learn as a manager is life is going to happen. There's going to be complexities and changes, but I think the one piece of advice that I received actually attending a conference was through a quote, and it's by Maya Angelou, and it
Mm,
says, "I've learned that people will never forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but
mm,
people will never forget how you made them feel."
right.
And as
Mm,
a manager of others, I wanna be that leader that others remember.
mhm,
I wanna be the person that, like, when they think about who is your best boss, like, it was Heather, right? And why is that? I think it's, that connection that we have that comes naturally as we work together and we just learn more about each other personally, professionally. But I can also tell you that, I've taken team members and I've moved them to other functions, thus bolstering their career and building them
mm,
up. I've created environments where people have had really tough personal conversations with me, but we've been able to dive into issues and really help position them for different moments of their lives. And so, what I would say is, if you manage people with inspiration and you leverage like compassion and empathy, and you do so with some of the change management techniques that we've explored
mhm,
with this podcast, I mean, people are just going to go so far.
mhm. Heather, I love the Maya Angelou comment. In fact, when we're working with executive leaders who sometimes struggle with empathy,
Mm.
we use that quote as a bit of an anchor for helping them reconnect with an empathetic response. Oftentimes, it's a very small adjustment, but Maya's quote helps solidify what I call their North Star. And it's so powerful because it tells a whole story in one sentence. People will always remember how you made them feel. And that is often very significant and very focusing for many of the folks that we work with. And finally, Heather, when I think about HR professionals coming up, what do you want them to know? Something that's going to contribute meaningfully to their success.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know a lot of people are nervous right now with AI on the forefront, and people are
Mm,
asking, like, how do I continue to learn and grow? And I mean, at the end of the day, the people who receive the best marks on their report cards or on their performance reviews or, on recommendations are people that solve problems.
mhm,
And the best HR professionals are those that listen and study the business to understand really what's needed from the function.
mm,
And then they partner together to drive a stellar solution. So at the earlier part of the podcast, we talked about going through that exploration of trying to understand like what's on the short-term horizon, what's on the long-term horizon. And if you can get that modeling into your everyday way of life, you're just going to be, driving amazing results and people are just going to be so appreciative and it's just that easy.
I love the concept of study the business, study the discipline, study the business, be a student. Even at my age, I consider myself a lifelong learner. I think there's a natural curiosity that supports that, but that focus on continuing to understand your business, continuing to understand your client business, and then building an expertise around that is phenomenal advice. Heather, I just have to tell you, thank you so much for joining us today. I've loved everything about our conversation, powerful perspectives, strategies. You have such significant accomplishments and significant awards, and I'm really hoping that our viewers and our listeners are taking a lot of value from the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jeff, and thank you to iBridge for all your continual support. You and I will remain friends and colleagues forever, and I just really appreciate spending time with you.
Thank you so much, Heather. We'll see you again soon.
Okay, take care.